Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if England became a republic. England, Britain and UK in this scenario will be used as synonyms. The time period I want to talk about is the time of the Commonwealth of England, where Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector. Oliver Cromwell was an English general and a statesman who led the Parliament forces against King Charles I during the English Civil War and ruled the British Isles as Lord Protector from 1653 until his death in 1658. His rule was of course a bit longer, but his title as Lord Protector only was for about 5 years. He acted simultaneously as a head of state and a head of government of the new Republican Commonwealth. And as you can see, I will use this period as the time period where England would stay a republic. Thus the title should technically be What if England stayed a republic, but seeing how the English Commonwealth only lasted a few years, one could argue that England never truly and really was a republic. Oliver Cromwell may not really be considered as a republican, but more of a dictator. The fact that he and his supporters won the Civil War and executed Charles I, it was not because they were in favor of republicanism, but because Charles I was a bad ruler. Charles I is known to have been an absolute monarch, and given the differences between countries like England and France, for instance, an absolute monarch in France made more sense due to the centralization that already existed in there than in England, for instance. One could say that Oliver Cromwell, he was the result of the bad policies of Charles I, and not because England had some republican traditions or movements that existed in there. The supporters of Oliver Cromwell, they were also very much involved in the military as well as in the parliament, and the English parliament of that time was not created because of republicanism, but because of politics that were pursued by the English rulers. One influence might have been the Germanic things, the primitive parliaments or the primitive meetings where things were discussed and they were kept orally but not in a written form. Another influence might also have been the Charter of Liberties and of course the very famous Magna Carta, of course. The point is that the monarchy was always very balanced in England, and thus a republic was not really the topic. The Commonwealth was established around 1649 after the execution of King Charles I, and the Roman Parliament had an executive and legislative power. The same applied for the Council of State, and Cromwell, well, he was a member of both. He went to war against Ireland because the royalists had many supporters in there and because they made a treaty which Cromwell took as casus belli. His foreign policies, they were aggressive but also very much anti-Catholic. He fought against the Scottish army, then set up a bare-bone parliament and became the Lord Protector in 1653 of England, Scotland and Ireland. A few important anecdotes are the fact that Oliver Cromwell never murdered the royal children. He put in charge a well-known royalist in Scotland called George Monk, and before the death of Charles I, Cromwell, he still insisted to have many talks with the king, and despite running the risk of getting murdered by his friends and also the lawyers of the army faction, well, he still did that because in some way he was not really anti-monarchist and thus not truly republican. Cromwell's rule was thus more a military dictatorship, influenced by his Puritanism. And after his weak son Richard took power, the Commonwealth fell apart and England became a monarchy once more. But what if all of that changed? What if England became a republic? The best point of divergence we can think of is that instead of Richard Cromwell becoming the successor of Oliver Cromwell, we would get his younger brother, for instance, Henry Cromwell. Where would this leave us? Well, first of all, in OTL, Henry Cromwell was a very successful person who governed Ireland. And in fact, he was so successful that people didn't want him to have any other function. Moreover, he was popular among the Irish, and it seemed that he was more compromising than his father, for instance. Let's not forget that Oliver Cromwell, he was really harsh with the Catholics. Henry Cromwell might still be harsh on the Catholics, but not to the same degree as his father. Another very important, if not the most important aspect is that Henry Cromwell, he made a career in the military. And while his brother was never part of the military and more seen as someone who was just there and who never really had any influence whatsoever. As a result, the Commonwealth would continue to exist with the rule of Henry Cromwell because he was part of the army. I am very sure that with Henry Cromwell in power, there wouldn't be any intrigues from within, or well, if there were some, they would just be capped to a minimal number. And the second Lord Protector wouldn't be questioned from his own ranks, because why would they question him if he was part of them? This means that people would actually cherish the rule of Henry Cromwell, and some enthusiasm might actually spread after the rule of his father. Puritanism would not just be suddenly disappearing from the political scene, but become less and less important over time. If Henry Cromwell managed to become popular in Ireland during our timeline as someone from England, then we could see him becoming popular within the Commonwealth. He might try to make compromises and perhaps even establish more tolerance for the different sects and movements within Christianity and Protestantism, and keeping a very ambiguous relationship with the Catholics, but not trying to do the same as his father did with them. Thus, the society of the Commonwealth would be a bit stronger, but rely on Henry Cromwell, who would become this uniting figure of a very disunited society. It is true that the army would actually be the one who would run the show behind Cromwell, yes. But as the higher-ups would become older and die, Cromwell would choose the successors and make the army more loyal to him. Cromwell would be well aware that the army could organize a coup at any given moment. Even in OGL, Henry Cromwell was well aware of the fact that the army had a lot of power and that the Commonwealth depended on the position of the Lord Protector. Henry Cromwell also wanted to get support from royalists and old parliamentarians in OTL, and I believe that in this ATL he would try to pull off something similar. Paired with the changes within the army, Cromwell could thus shift away from Puritanism and try to get more consensus from those that were allowed to vote. Henry Cromwell may still have been a bit dictatorial in this timeline, but I believe that his rule would be less dictatorial than that of his father. The parliament may have gotten more power, and with his ability to compromise and to keep the army in check, the Commonwealth would be stable. Finances may be the only problem for a while, but after some Caribbean islands they would be conquered in this timeline, this wouldn't be any more problem. And the defeats against the Dutch in the following years, they may even not have happened at all under the rule of Henry Cromwell. The newly acquired territories would help the Commonwealth to reduce taxes, and by winning the wars more decisively, financial problems, they would be solved. The Netherlands could turn from commercial rival much later on into a natural ally to the Commonwealth, and both they could ally each other against the French. This means that France may lose their colonies in the Americas earlier, Spain would still be an enemy to the Commonwealth, but later down the line they would ally sometimes with Spain. The Netherlands could be in an interesting position. In 1667, the Orangist faction of the Netherlands wanted to bring William III of England to power. But due to a peace treaty signed by Oliver Cromwell, it was stated that no prince could take the position of the stadtholder, leaving it vacant as a result. France could perhaps intervene and we could see an interesting conflict in the Netherlands, resulting in a big civil war. The Netherlands may become a French puppet kingdom, while the Commonwealth would then try to absorb the Dutch colonies. The American colonies would also see a different outcome. More Catholics, they would move to the American colonies, while England would be a little bit more Protestant, Calvinist, and see a very diverse Protestant society. The colonies would evolve in a different demographic way as in OTL, but it would not be enough to make the colonies suddenly totally Catholic. Another interesting aspect is that if the Enlightenment in that timeline would actually still arise, it would become definitely more Republican. After years of existence, the system of the Commonwealth would become more Republican due to the reforms that would be made by Henry Cromwell, and without the constitutional monarchy in England. The only alternative to monarchism could only be republicanism. There would not be this approach of having a constitution that would limit the power of the monarch. No, people would discuss the republican system. And there would be many republican systems, such as the one of Venice, then the former system of the Netherlands, before they actually became a French puppet state, and the English one. The consequence of this is that France especially would make many efforts to keep the republican system unpopular, and they would sponsor many revolts. Instead of supporting the Northern American colonies against the British, they might support the Caribbean possessions. Many aristocrats lived in there and they were, of course, royalists. And if the French still get kings that would bankrupt their country, the monarchy as a system would probably die out with the French Revolution. The Commonwealth will support the spread of the idea of a republic, but once something akin to the Premier Empire would set foot in France, well, all the alarm bells they would ring and they would go to war and still play the same role as in OTL. The Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, they would sit on ticking time bombs and probably collapse much earlier or change in a very radical way. Europe would become a mess while the Commonwealth could expand its overseas possessions and keep their colonies for a much longer time. Sure, the royalists in the Caribbean would be a pain in the ass, but they were easier to deal with than the rebels from the 13 colonies. That gave birth to the US. As a result, the Commonwealth would become the most dominant power of the world. The first few years of the Commonwealth would see the office of Lord Protector shifting from a dictator towards a more presidential office, and much of Europe, if not the world, may see the Republic as a much better system. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.